Now, we're going to bring you some even more good news. Food service theft and the influence of peers. This is a fascinating topic based on research that has been done over many years. And today, joining us is Miss Juliette Gust, co-founder and president of Ethics Suite. Juliette operates out of Scottsdale, but again, very similar to Grace, Juliette has a national practice along with her partner that operates out of the New York area. But these two ladies have extraordinary experience in fraud investigations, not just nationally, but internationally, as you can see from the bio information here. They've led over 2,000 investigations throughout the world. And they have started Ethics Suite to create an opportunity for employers to get a handle on what's going on in their businesses, to understand the cost of fraud and other types of challenges that go on in your business. But they've also created this super duper hotline that gives people the ability to reach out anonymously to get information, but also to begin an investigation should it need to be. So we are not accused of putting our heads in the sand, which can really be a problem for us. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Juliette Gust.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I wish you could be on some of my demo calls for the hotline. That was a really great introduction, and I appreciate it. It is exciting. It's a very tough subject that a lot of people don't like to talk about. But Grace, you couldn't have set me up any better with your discussion, where we already know that we have low margins. We already know we have a staffing crisis. There's been a lot of talk about low employee engagement and quiet quitting. And there's also kind of a spillover effect of wrongdoing that stems from theft, which is, other misconduct like sexual harassment, abuse, or bullying. And so that's one of the reasons why it's really important to talk about misconduct, make sure that it is not brushed under the carpet, that these issues are handled immediately, and that more importantly, they're handled internally before they become public. We saw not long ago a harassment issue that was brought up on Facebook by an employee, and it was shared more than 600 times before the owner of that restaurant got a chance to even look at it. So, these things kind of fly around at the speed of the internet, we like to say. And so, that's why it's important that we talk about this today. And like Stephen said, this study, personally, I was fascinated with it. We'll show you the numbers soon, but it was very extensive. It was over many years. Millions of touch points with servers in 34 different restaurant chains. And, the effects were, to me, alarming, but also very eye-opening. And I think not too difficult to get under control if, monitoring is appropriate and in place. But like we said, with staffing the way it is, it's difficult. And so we want to talk about maybe some ways to mitigate those effects as we go through this. And then I'll show you a couple of other studies very briefly, which show the kind of general state of fraud and theft in other industries. The prevailing thought is that about 5% of revenues are taken from organizations due to theft. And in food service, we've heard estimates as high as 75% of employees will steal. We've heard that about 4% of revenues, this is from the National Restaurant Association, will be taken from the companies in theft. And those are big numbers. If we consider that maybe 3 to 5% of budgets could be a marketing budget. These are funds that we need them to put them back into our business. Maybe we need them for training. Maybe we need them for raises and bonuses. But they're certainly better spent than theft. So if we can move on to the next slide, we'll get started. And as I said, this Olin study was conducted over 7 years at more than 1,000 restaurants, 34 chains, 46 states. So it encompassed the whole country, 83,000 servers. And the unique observations for that 7-year period were 5.7 million. So those are 5.7 million interactions, transactions that were viewed from this study, which is, extremely compelling and very, very, a lot of the coverage was intensive. So if we could move on again, please. The interesting results of this study was to see that the restaurant employees who engaged in unethical or illegal behavior influenced other employees to participate in that similar misconduct. New employees, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but new employees were particularly vulnerable to these norms and behaviors of their coworkers due to the kind of imprinting mechanisms that include knowledge transfer, the culture of the restaurant, norm setting. And you'll see in a little bit that depending on the amount of the technology that's available, and not just the technology, but the monitoring of that technology by managers on the floor, managers monitoring activities, servers learn to steal more or steal less on any given day, depending on how much others were stealing. So they communicated, they knew that if they got past a certain level, that they would be caught. And so people learn to keep it at a certain level, keep it below the point of detection so that they can continue to steal without being caught. And we can go to the next one, please. And these reflection effects, the results of these reflection effects were so important. I'd like to read to you exactly what was said from the study, which is the cost of employing unethical workers is higher than the direct cost of those workers' misconduct because their behavior spills over into coworkers' actions and amplifies them through these reflection effects. An unethical employee may affect many peers simultaneously, and they in turn will affect others. It is this contagion or normalization of corruption that generates astounding levels of misconduct within organizations. And so thank you for bearing with me, and I'd be happy to make that whole study available to you. If you like, we can mail it out. The numbers behind those studies were that just doubling one worker's theft effects would increase the amount 76%. But if you include all of the workers on that given shift, not just in the restaurant, but on that given shift, the theft amount would increase 550%. And so, like we said, the effect on new employees are most important, particularly the 3rd and 5th month. And so this can give you some kind of ammunition to look at your onboarding processes, which we'll talk about more later, but your training processes as well, and your reporting processes. Where are new people supposed to go if they feel uncomfortable in a given situation? Maybe in their first month, they're terrified of everyone and everything. They don't really feel like it's in their place to voice this discomfort. But as they get to their 3rd and 4th month, they should feel more comfortable. They should have already established some friendships and maybe made ties with more positive influence employees that they could talk to about the issues that they see so that these kind of bad apples can be removed. We can move to the next one and talk about the managerial implications. As I said, the cost of employing them is higher than the direct cost of their actual misconduct, and their contagion can be mitigated through this managerial oversight and monitoring. Now, the POS systems today are very advanced. They have really great features where you can monitor all kinds of anomalies, look at excessive voids, look at other issues. But the problem is most people aren't looking at those reports. So they're available to you, but they're not being used. And if they are being used, they're being used, very infrequently. And again, servers understand their managers' capabilities. They understand how they're being monitored and how often they're being monitored. And so the bad apples with high levels of misconduct are more costly than their individual behavior because it's spilling over into all of the others. They're propagating this culture of misconduct, and the managers are so busy doing their own work that they're not really monitoring and auditing the activity so that they can put a stop to it faster. I can give you an example. There's a restaurant company that we worked with that had a manager that was transferred 5 times. And this manager's turnover percentage was 200%. Now, in comparison to other managers, theirs was 45%. So obviously there was an issue. There was an issue with this particular manager's management style. There actually were complaints about, the way that they spoke to employees and the way that they managed people. They said they were, kind of treated without respect and so on. And these issues were ignored, and the manager, because they had good good relationships with their supervisors, they were just able to kind of float through and go to 5 different positions in 5 different places before they actually are still with the company in a special advisor position. But you can see how the damage is done when people see that, you know, we are repeatedly telling you about these issues and you're not really doing anything about it. So we're just going to leave and go somewhere else. And it's the same with the rock star effect. There are employees who are great in almost every way. And so their theft is overlooked because managers might think, well, you know, I've actually heard this from owners who tell me, well, I bake that into the cost. So for example, a bartender, I know that they're taking, you know, 20% of the cash, they're skimming it. And so I raise my prices 20%. And that's okay, but they're not considering those contagion effects. They're not considering that other people are seeing this happen. They're not considering that by allowing that, they're allowing that. You know, they say that the standard you walk past is the standard that you accept. And so that's exactly what's going on there. And people see it and it continues. And, you know, there's something that a colleague of mine who is a really great fraud investigator calls the potato chip theory of fraud. And it's the same with theft. You know, if I take a little bit and no one notices, I continue to take more until it becomes big enough to notice. It's just like eating a bag of potato chips. You can't just have one. You can't just steal one time. If you don't get caught, you'll continue to do it. And so the thefts become bolder and they become bigger. And like I said, the intervention, if it's only when the theft is repeated and substantial, it may be too late. And I'll show you some of those numbers in a couple of slides on how many months it could take to discover theft and fraud schemes within your organization. Can we move to the next slide, please? Here, as you can see, the median duration, this is specifically for the food service and hospitality industry. And now we're switching over to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners study. This was done in 2018. And in 2022, the median loss per case decreased some, which is great news. So the median loss back in 2018, as you can see here, was 90,000 and lasted 15 months before it was identified. That's a really long time for a scheme to be unraveled. And like I said, a lot of the time it's because of a lack of monitoring or a lack of attention to these issues because there's so many other things going on in restaurant operations. In 2021, the median loss per case actually decreased to 55,000, which is good news. But I think part of that has to do with some of the COVID issues that we had. We had lower revenues. And so, of course, there were less opportunities for fraud and theft. But as we go back to kind of a more normal atmosphere, we should see that grow. I hope that we don't, but we probably will. The other interesting thing is the most common schemes. So if you're just thinking of theft and theft of cash, as you can see, 43% between skimming and cash on hand. So 43% of those schemes had to do with cash. That's really very difficult to overcome. And monitor. And then the common anti-fraud controls, I'm not sure if the lettering is big enough for you to see it, but when we talk about controlling fraud, you'll see the first thing there is a code of conduct. I've worked with a lot of clients who tell me, oh yes, I have an employee handbook, I have a code of conduct, I give it to everybody when they start, and then I start interviewing employees. Have you seen the code of conduct? No, I've never heard of it. Have you seen your handbook? No, I've ever heard of it. Have you been told where you can report wrongdoing? No, I don't know. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes, especially with larger organizations that have more than one unit. And so you might lose sight of the daily operations of those particular units, of what exactly is going on. If there's, you know, a revolving door of employees, it's also tough to make sure that that onboarding process continues the way it's supposed to. Can we move to the next slide? And so, as I was saying, these are some of the fraud and theft prevention techniques. We talked about onboarding and training and making sure that no matter how busy everyone is, that these issues are handled and they're done with the diligence that is required. I see there's a question. Okay. Feel free to interrupt if you have a question during the session. I'd be happy to answer it. Sometimes Zoom is a little different than in person because I can't see a raised hand, but if I see a question, I'll look at it. And then during that onboarding process, we want to give employees options for reporting wrongdoing. A lot of times, the only option for reporting it is tell your supervisor. But if it's the supervisor that's doing that's involved in whatever the misconduct is, then that employee has nowhere to go. Just as an example, there was a fast food restaurant in Ohio, I think it was, that had a meth lab. I mean, sorry, a meth ring that was being operated out of that restaurant. And the employees all said it was the manager who was operating this ring. Who were we supposed to tell? And so by the time the franchisor became aware of it, it was already in the news and too late. And so giving your employees, whether it be private, public, franchise, whatever the case might be, but giving them a variety of options to report. The first, of course, should include their supervisor, and it would be great if they felt comfortable enough to talk to them about these issues. And then the second could be HR. And if there's no one, there's no HR resource available within the organization, are there legal resources? Is there an owner that's kind of the buck stops here, where employees can report to them safely and without a fear of retaliation? Are they told that they can report safely and without a fear of retaliation? Are they told that, their name would be kept confidential if there is an investigation? These are all things that potential reporters, some people call them whistleblowers, but because of the negative connotations, I prefer reporters, that they will not report if they feel like, my manager is going to make fun of me, or maybe they're going to change my shifts, or maybe they'll fire me, and then they don't want to report. So these processes should also be refreshed at least annually, where employees are reminded this is where you can report. You can report supervisor, HR, maybe you have an anonymous reporting channel, which is really important to have as well. And you can, second, make sure that those issues are addressed, that they're not ignored, because people do talk. I've seen, restaurant chains with thousands of employees discuss issues across the country, especially now with social media the way it is. And people know if I report an issue and it's handled, they'll tell their peers, hey, you can do the same thing. I reported this issue and I was told, really quickly that it was going to be handled, and it was. And then lastly, the technology that's available, use it. So the POS systems that have reports, how often are they checked? How are managers trained to use it? Do they compare their servers' sales with their tips? Do they compare it against each other? Do they look at whether servers have been in the same position for many years and question that? Maybe it's a great place to work, and that's true, but there are oftentimes employees who don't leave their roles because they're profiting substantially from their schemes. So, for example, I can tell you in a hotel, I recall a housekeeper whose average salary over a 5-year period was $8 per hour. And this person was given multiple opportunities to be promoted. And their answer, they said they did a great job. They were offered opportunities to be promoted. And their answer was always that they love their job and they love the people that they work with, and they wouldn't want to do anything else. So this is a little bit of a red flag, because that's true, but who really would deny the opportunity to make more money, or to have another position, or to have more people reporting to them? And it turned out that this person had 33 ghost employees that they were cashing their paychecks every week. So there's a lot of stories, of course, that I could share, but I won't share all of them today, but happy to follow up as needed. Is there a next slide? Questions?
Yeah, that's Juliette's
Stephen, I'm sure you have a couple.
I do, Juliette. Yeah, it's fascinating and frightening at the same time, are the words that are going through my mind. But ladies and gentlemen, there's Juliette's contact information and the website. And as you can tell from her presentation, she and her whole team, they are just so well grounded in this. It's incredible. Just think about the volume of investigations they participated in. Over 2,000. That's an enormous number. But Juliette, talking about metrics, I think the point you made so well in a couple of different places in your presentation is that oftentimes we gather information and then we don't use it. We don't look at it, right? And so that metric, the turnover rate of employees, when this manager had been at a location, that turnover rate followed him someplace else. It followed him someplace else. that should be a red flag, because as we've probably all heard, people get hired by a company, but then they quit their boss. Is that kind of also your mantra as well? Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's usually an issue with the supervisor. When it comes to employee relations, so it depends when it comes to other schemes like bribery or theft or fraud. But when it comes to employee relations, absolutely, almost 100% of the time, it's an issue with the manager that leads to it's called there's a theory about why people commit fraud, and it's the triangle. And so there's these three factors: rationalization and opportunity and motive. And the supervisor issue comes into play with both the rationalization and the motive, because if people are very unhappy within their organization, or they feel like they're treated badly, that's their motive. They don't care about me, or they're not going to notice that $1 is missing, or they're not going to notice that $5,000 is missing, or they don't pay me enough anyway. So these are kind of the things that people use to rationalize their theft. And so it's important to manage that.
Oh, for sure. And speaking of that, that I have a question. I think we're seeing less cash being used, right? As we're going to more payment card type payments, right? Apple Pay, etc. Are you seeing less theft at the point of sale? The bartenders, the servers, the cashier, but more theft at the executive level?
Yes and no. So people are clever. So the lack of cash, is daunting, but there are ways around it. So especially if there's collusion involved. So for example, maybe it's not a theft of cash, but it's theft of inventory. And I can have my friend come in and use their card to pay for one thing, but I give them 10. And then I go and sell it, or maybe, my friends just have a great time on me. And then the same thing with gift cards, so loyalty points. There's a lot of fraud around those companies that offer points, because they're very easy to manipulate. And so either I can manipulate the points myself by getting these cards and putting one of the biggest schemes I see is people that don't have the loyalty card, but I use their purchase to add their points to my own card, and then I can build it up that way. But other ways are to have friends do it, and the same way they can pretend they're offering it to different people, maybe for a discount or a free appetizer, but really what they're doing is generating all those points so that they can cash them in for whatever the rewards are for themselves, or they can sell them. And this is a much bigger issue as you get into outside of food, and maybe you go into hotel loyalty points where you can get free stays, or airline points where you can get flights. Those are a bit more sophisticated.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Some of the biggest scams on the hotel side, the internal scams, has been the affinity programs.
They're very big. And you mentioned executives. And so the affinity programs may not only be perpetrated by the employees, but by the managers, because they could have certain bonuses that are tied to those use or not use of those loyalty points. And in some cases, the price of the room changes depending on the occupancy. And so, for example, maybe you'll get reimbursed a certain amount if your occupancy is below 90%, but you'll get reimbursed another amount if your occupancy is above 90%. And so I want to make sure that my occupancy is above 90%. And I've even seen people put rooms in the name of Mickey Mouse. Just, hey, I'm going to give Mickey Mouse the room because that pushes me over the 90% mark. So like I said, people are clever, and there are a lot of controls available, but there seems to always be a way around of control. And like you mentioned earlier, and I said that the constant monitoring is very important, but the trust between the employees who are your eyes and ears and can tell you what's going on, that's probably even more important than the monitoring, because as you saw in that infographic that we had up there before, tips are really the number one way how people identify all kinds of schemes, not just theft and fraud, but kickbacks and other corruption, as well as, accounts payable issues and so on. So having that line of communication open without fear of retaliation is key.
Yeah, those phantom accounts that you mentioned, especially in payables, right? And I remember the story about the accounts payable clerk that had 20 or 30 phantom accounts, and then they had them at different post office boxes, around the city. And it was millions of dollars before the company figured it out.
Yeah, and like I said, people are clever. I remember one vendor master who actually knew enough to know to look at, I'm sure you're familiar with escheatment. And so they knew
Yes.
enough to know which people were paid and didn't cash their checks. And a year later, very patient, of course, they were in this role, and they were just kind of had a scheme going where every person that didn't cash their check, they took it.
Whoa.
So they weren't caught until someone talked about it.
Yeah, right. Wow. Listen, I want to address the question that was posted, and yes, you will have access to these videos and, of course, the PowerPoints as well. So we'll make sure that everybody gets that. Let's see. Grace sends us a note. Performance or incentive bonuses for manager or management teams help encourage, reward higher performance, but can be vulnerable to abuse or fraud. Did you hear that, Juliette? Yeah.
Yes. And thank you for bringing that up. It's very true.
Thanks, Grace. Yeah.
Grace, you're absolutely right. And I was going to mention, thank you for reminding me that tying bonuses to ethics and compliance issues is a really great idea and yields very positive results. I think lately a lot of companies have tied retention to bonuses, but they haven't tied these kinds of other, more uglier issues to it, like employee relations, harassment, discrimination, abuse, bullying, theft, fraud. That hasn't been tied to compensation, but whenever it is, it certainly has a lot more focus on it. And Grace, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, that's a great idea, tying all performance in those areas into the incentive structure. I like that. Of course, it has to be done carefully, as I'm sure you know, but that's why a group would hire you, because you would draft it carefully with your experience. I do have a question in that HR area, which is so challenging these days. But the hotel and restaurant industries, Juliette, they have a history of that type of behavior being rather ubiquitous on the harassment side, especially, right? On the sex-based harassment. And so I'm mindful of a case that I was involved in. It's been many years, so I'm hopeful things have changed. But the young woman was working, and the policy said you have to go to your supervisor first. Well, in this case, the supervisor was the one doing the harassing. So she tried to go directly to the HR director, who was a woman, actually. But she kept saying she would not even let the employee share the facts with her. The HR director kept saying, "Have you talked to your supervisor?" And the employee said, "No, because I can't." And the HR director said, "If you haven't talked to your supervisor, then I can't speak to you." Well, and it put the employee in a horrible situation. So how do you modify the policy? I know you mentioned there needs to be several outlets and options, but do you see that, and how do you ensure that the employee is comfortable to get outside or to go somewhere than that line of abuse that's going on?
There are different ways, and I see Grace nodding, so maybe you want to jump in. There are a lot of ways, but the number one is what's called the tone from the top. And so what is it that the leadership of whatever the organization is tell everyone? Do they insist that HR has the freedom to do whatever they want? I've seen in many cases that HR is hamstrung, and they're told that they're not welcome, and they're told that, this is not your job to handle these issues, and all I need you to do is recruit and maybe train and maybe, deal with the paperwork of hiring new employees, but these employee relations issues are not for you to handle. And that's the wrong approach, because there's certainly no independent function that can help the employees sort through these issues. So that has to come from leadership that allows HR, empowers HR to handle these issues on their own without needing to go through management. And the same thing with how they unroll or develop their code of conduct. Is maybe the CEO, is there a video or them in person coming to the room when there's people onboarding, just to show, hey, this is really important to me. I remember from my days talking about fraud at the hotel company, the CFO himself would come to my fraud trainings and tell people, hey, look, even if I walk up to your desk and ask you to do something that you know that is out of the ordinary or you're not supposed to do or doesn't follow protocol, then you tell me no. And that's totally okay. And so that kind of support that comes from the top really sets the tone for everyone to know this is acceptable or not acceptable.
Yeah,
Does that make
that's very
sense?
helpful. It makes perfect sense. Thank you. Listen, we're about to run out of time, but I want to ask you very quickly, without sharing proprietary information, but can you tell the audience a little bit about your hotline program and
Oh,
how
thank
that
you.
works? Yeah.
Yes, so it's all digital. I think that today, especially in these industries where a lot of the workforce is younger, they don't use the phone anymore to talk, and so the typical
Right.
hotline operator feature is going away. You know, we can see that in the statistics as well. It's sharply declining. People don't feel comfortable talking on the phone. Sometimes they think they're being recorded. And so we capture these on, you know, with the app and on a website so people can use their phone or their tablet or from wherever they are to report an issue. And that issue goes to whoever the employer designates. So, for example, if the company says, you know, these are going to go to the director of HR, I have a restaurant company that's a chain, and their reports go to their director of HR, and they also go to another director that they have for ethics and compliance issues, so that there are two sets of eyes on any problem, and then they work through who it is responsible for investigating it, and they investigate it. And then the tool allows for documentation, which, as you probably know, when it comes to litigation, is extremely important. I've had people tell me, oh, I have hundreds of employee relations issues that I handled, but they can't prove one because they didn't put
Oh,
anything down. And so our tool allows them to keep all of that in one repository. You know, here are my interview notes, or maybe here's the worksheets that I used. Here's the write-up that I gave an employee, or here's the termination letter, or here's the leave of absence letter, or suspension that we required. And so, you know, you can have names and dates of things that are what happened, so that oftentimes that litigation that takes place 2-3 years later, you forget, there's turnover, but you can prove that you took action and that you took appropriate action for every step. So it's actually very simple. But again, it's is it used? You know, do I offer it to my employees? Do I encourage them to use it? Do I become aware of issues? And when I am, do I investigate them? And then can I prove I investigated them appropriately? So it's simple and it's very cost effective.
oh, that's great. Well, thanks for sharing that, Juliette. And your
Thank
presentation
you.
was terrific. Thank you very much for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, a big thank you to Juliette Gust of Ethics Suite.
Thanks, everyone.